She thought her father abandoned her to a life in the system. When she inherited his derelict workshop on her 18th birthday, she found a truth hidden under the floorboards that would change not just her future, but the meaning of her entire past. What she discovered there wasn't about money. It was about a debt that could only be paid with courage. If you've ever felt like your story was written by someone else, stick around and hit that subscribe button, because this is a place for people who are learning to write their own endings. The finality of it didn't hit me when I signed the papers. It didn't hit me when Mrs. Albright, the group home director who always smelled faintly of disinfectant and disappointment, gave me a stiff, one-armed hug. It didn't even hit me when they handed me the bus ticket and a manila envelope with my name, Elara Vance, typed on the front. No, the finality of it, the terrifying, stomach-dropping reality of being 18, washed over me on the bus, watching the gray institutional buildings of the city shrink in the grime-streaked window. 2 years of waiting for this day, 2 years of counting down the minutes until I was free, and now that it was here, my freedom felt as thin and flimsy as the paper ticket clutched in my hand. Inside the envelope was a birth certificate, a social security card, $87 in cash, and a single old-fashioned brass key taped to a folded deed. That was the sum total of my inheritance, a key to a place I'd never been, left by a father I barely remembered. The bus engine droned, a monotonous hum that vibrated through the worn seat and up into my bones. For hours, the landscape blurred by, flat, tired fields giving way to rolling hills dotted with skeletal winter trees. I was heading north, to a town called Sparrow Creek, a name that sounded like a lie, something too gentle for the world I knew. My father had died there 2 years ago. A workplace accident, the social worker had said. Quick, she'd added, as if that was some kind of consolation. He hadn't been in my life for over a decade, not since my mom died and he'd placed me in state care, promising to come back when he got things sorted. He never did. He just became a ghost, a series of unanswered questions that festered in the quiet moments of my life. And now I was inheriting his final failure, a piece of property with 3 years of back taxes owed, and according to the terse legal letter that came with the deed, a standing offer from a company called Northwood Developments. The lawyer's letter had called it a generous offer, a lifeline. I called it a ghost selling off another ghost's property. The bus hissed to a stop at a crossroads marked by a single blinking yellow light. Sparrow Creek, the driver grunted, not even turning around. I was the only one who got off. The air was different here, sharper. It smelled of pine and damp earth, and something else, something metallic and cold, like distant snow. There was no station, just a gravel shoulder and a weathered wooden sign. The town, what I could see of it, was a small collection of buildings huddled together a quarter-mile down the road. According to the map I'd printed at the library, the property was another 2 miles in the opposite direction. 2 miles. I pulled the thin collar of my jacket tighter and started walking. The silence was unnerving. In the city, there was always a hum, a siren, the distant rumble of traffic. Here, the only sounds were the crunch of my worn boots on the gravel and the rustle of a bitter wind through the dry leaves still clinging to the oaks. It felt like walking into a photograph from 100 years ago. The lawyer, a Mr. Davies, had an office in a small brick building on the town's main street, squeezed between a hardware store and a closed-down diner. The paint on his sign was peeling, the gold letters flaking away. He was an old man, with kind eyes and a face etched with the worries of 1,000 small-town problems. He looked at me over the top of his glasses, his expression a mixture of pity and professional duty. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice raspy, "I'm sorry for your loss. Again." I just nodded. The loss was old news to me. "Your father, he was a good man, quiet, kept to himself." He shuffled the papers on his cluttered desk. "Now, about the property. The taxes are significant. Northwood's offer would cover them and leave you with a substantial amount, enough for a fresh start somewhere." He slid a piece of paper across the desk. The number on it was staggering. More money than I had ever imagined holding in my hands. It was an escape route, a one-way ticket to anywhere but here, anywhere but the life I'd had. "They want the land for a new resort development," he explained. "They've been buying up properties all along the lake." Why did he never sell? I asked, the question surprising me with its suddenness. Mr. Davies sighed, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. Stubbornness, I suppose. He loved that place. Said it was the only thing he had left of your mother. The words landed like small, sharp stones. It was the first time in years anyone had mentioned my mother in connection to him. The system files you away, and your parents become footnotes, reasons for your placement. They lose their humanity. He had loved her, and he had kept the one thing that was hers. The lawyer cleared his throat, pulling me back to the present. The offer is only on the table for another 30 days, Alara. After that, the county will likely seize the property for the back taxes. This is your best and, frankly, your only option. The pressure was gentle, but it was there. Sell, take the money, run. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the smart thing to do. It was what everyone expected the damaged kid from the system to do. I looked down at the key in my hand, its teeth worn smooth. I want to see it first, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Mr. Davies nodded slowly, a flicker of something, surprise, respect, in his eyes. Of course, it's your property, for now. He gave me directions, a hand-drawn map on the back of a legal pad. As I left, he called out, Your father was a craftsman, you know, a carpenter. He could make anything out of wood. I didn't know. It was another piece of a puzzle I'd long ago given up on solving. The walk from town was longer than the first. The road turned from cracked asphalt to dirt, and the trees grew thicker, their branches interlocking overhead to form a tunnel. Then I saw it, a rusted mailbox, half hidden by overgrown bushes, with the name Vance barely legible. A gravel driveway, more weeds than stone, snaked back into the woods. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The house was worse than I had imagined. It was a small, single-story clapboard building, its paint peeling in long, curling strips like sunburnt skin. The roof sagged in the middle, and a shutter hung from a single hinge, banging a lonely rhythm in the wind. The yard was a wild tangle of thorns and dead grass. It wasn't a home. It was a ruin, a monument to decay. For a moment, I just stood there, the weight of it all pressing down on me. This was my legacy, a broken-down house and a mountain of debt. The sensible thing to do was to turn around, walk back to Mr. Davies' office, and sign the papers. I could be on a bus to a new city, a new life, by morning. But then I saw the workshop. It stood about 50 yards behind the house, a larger, sturdier building made of weathered pine and corrugated metal. It looked solid. While the house seemed to be surrendering to nature, the workshop stood its ground. It looked like it had been built to last. I walked towards it, my boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. The key Mr. Davies had given me was for the house. The workshop was secured with a heavy padlock, rusted but formidable. Of course, the place he actually lived in, the place he worked, would be locked up tight. I circled the building, peering through the grimy windows. Inside, I could see the silhouettes of tools hanging on pegboards, the dark shape of a large workbench, and stacks of lumber. It was a place of work, a place of purpose. My father was a craftsman. He could make anything out of wood. I went back to the house. The brass key slid into the lock with a grating sound. It took some effort. My shoulder pressed against the warped wood, but the door finally groaned open. The air that rushed out was stale and cold, thick with the dust of forgotten years. It smelled of mice and mildew and a faint, lingering scent of something I couldn't place. Turpentine, maybe, or old paper. I stepped inside and the door swung shut behind me, plunging me into near darkness. A sliver of gray light filtered through a dirty window, illuminating a constellation of dust motes dancing in the air. I could make out the shapes of furniture draped in white sheets, like a congregation of ghosts. I pulled one off a couch, the fabric stiff and cold. The floral pattern beneath was faded, a relic from another time. This was my mother's house. He had kept it, just like Mr. Davies said, but he hadn't lived in it. He had let it fall apart, preserving it like a tomb while he worked and slept in the workshop. I didn't understand. None of it made sense. The urge to flee was a physical thing, a tightness in my chest. This place was full of a sadness so profound it felt like it was seeping into my skin. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to know why. Why he left me. Why he let this place rot. Why he never came back. I decided to stay, just for a night or two. I had a sleeping bag in my backpack and some food. I could camp out on the floor of this ghost house and make a decision with a clear head. I found a broom in a closet and swept a small patch of the living room floor clean. I laid out my sleeping bag, the synthetic fabric a stark, modern intrusion in the decaying room. As dusk settled, the temperature dropped. There was no power, no water. I ate a cold protein bar and huddled inside my bag, listening to the house settle around me. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of a window pane in the wind, sounded like a footstep, a whisper. I felt like an intruder in my own history. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind raced, replaying the conversation with the lawyer. A fresh start. The words echoed in the darkness. It was all I had ever wanted. But was running away the same as starting fresh? Was selling this last, broken piece of my family the only way to build a future? I thought about my father. The man in my memories was a vague sketch. The scratch of his beard, the smell of sawdust on his clothes, the low rumble of his laugh. That was all I had. The state had files, pages of sterile, bureaucratic text, but they didn't have the man. This place, this ruin, was all that was left of him, and I was about to sell it to the highest bidder without even trying to understand it. Sometime in the deep of the night, I made a new decision. I wasn't just going to stay for a night. I was going to clean the place out. I would go through his things, sort through the wreckage of his life, and find my own answers, if there were any to be found. And I would start with the workshop. The next morning I walked into town. The air was crisp, and the rising sun cast long, distorted shadows across the road. The hardware store was open. An old man with a friendly, weathered face stood behind the counter. "Help you?" he asked. "I need a pair of bolt cutters," I said. He raised an eyebrow but didn't ask any questions. He just shuffled to the back of the store and returned with a heavy red-handled tool. As I paid, he looked at me, his gaze direct. "You're Frank Vance's girl, aren't you? You've got his eyes." I was stunned into silence. Someone knew him. Someone remembered him. "He was a good man," the man said, bagging the cutters. "Quiet, but a hell of a carpenter. Built half the porches in this town." I found my voice. "I'm Ilara." "George," he said, offering a calloused hand. "If you need anything, you come see me. That place, it's going to need a lot of work." It was a simple exchange, but it changed something in me. My father wasn't just a file number or a ghost. He was Frank Vance. He built porches. He was remembered. Walking back to the property, the bolt cutters felt heavy in my hand, like a responsibility. The padlock on the workshop door was thick and rusted, but the cutters bit into the metal with a satisfying crunch. The shackles snapped, and the lock fell to the ground. I pulled the heavy wooden door open, and it slid sideways on a groaning track. The air inside was different from the house. It was clean, dry. It smelled of cedar and oil and cold steel. Sunlight streamed through the high, dusty windows, illuminating a space that was both chaotic and meticulously organized. Tools hung in their designated spots on the walls, their metal heads gleaming. Saws, hammers, drills, chisels of every size. Jars of screws and nails were neatly labeled on shelves. Stacks of lumber, oak, pine, maple, were sorted by size and type against the far wall. This was not the space of a man who had given up. This was the workspace of a man who knew what he was doing. In the center of the room stood a massive workbench, its surface scarred with the marks of 1,000 projects. A half-finished birdhouse sat on one corner, a delicate, intricate thing. A fine layer of sawdust covered everything, a pale shroud over a life cut short. I spent the rest of the day just being in there. I ran my hands over the cool, smooth handles of the tools. I breathed in the scent of the wood. This place felt more real, more alive than the silent, sheet-draped house. This was where he had lived. A small cot was folded in a corner, next to a hot plate and a small, dusty pantry. He had slept here, eaten here, worked here. He had retreated from the world and from the memories in the house, and poured all of himself into this one room. My mission to simply clean it out now felt like a desecration. This was a sanctuary. But I knew I had to. I couldn't leave it like this. I had to sort through it, to understand it. I started with the clutter on the floor, empty cans, old rags, scraps of wood. I worked methodically, sweeping and sorting, bagging up the trash. It was hard physical work, and my muscles, unaccustomed to it, ached. But it felt good. It felt productive. As I worked, I felt a strange connection to the man I never knew. I could almost see him here, his hands steady, his focus absolute, shaping a piece of wood into something beautiful and useful. The sun was beginning to set, casting long orange rays through the windows when I decided to move the workbench. It was huge and heavy, made of solid oak. I wanted to sweep underneath it. I braced myself, putting my shoulder into it, and pushed. It didn't budge. I tried again, digging my heels in. It scraped a few inches across the concrete floor with a deafening screech. I kept at it, pushing and resting, inch by painful inch, until I had moved it about 3 feet from the wall, and that's when I saw it. The concrete floor was smooth and unbroken, except for one small section, right where the center of the workbench had been. There was a faint, rectangular outline, almost invisible under the layer of dust. And in the center of the rectangle was a small, recessed metal ring, flush with the floor. It was a trap door. My breath caught in my throat. I knelt down, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I brushed away the dust. It wasn't a trap door to a cellar. The house had no cellar. It was a compartment, a hidden space. I hooked my fingers through the cold metal ring and pulled. It was heavy, sealed tight with age and disuse. I braced my feet and pulled with all my strength. With a low groan of protest and a puff of stale, musty air, a section of the floor lifted. It was a cleverly disguised concrete plug, about 2 feet square. Beneath it was a dark, hollow space. My hands were trembling as I reached for the small flashlight on my keychain. I aimed the weak beam into the hole. The space was lined with metal, like a safe set into the floor, and nestled inside was a single object, a green, metal ammunition box, the kind I'd seen in old war movies. It was sealed shut. For a long time, I just stared at it, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. My mind was a whirlwind of questions. What was this? Why was it hidden so carefully? Was this why he never sold the property? The sensible part of my brain, the part that had been trained by years of institutional living to expect the worst, screamed at me to close the lid, push the workbench back, and walk away. Go back to town, sign the papers, and take the money. This was something I wasn't supposed to find. But I couldn't. I had to know. I had come here for answers, and I had a feeling they were inside that box. Getting it open was another challenge. It was locked with 2 heavy-duty latches, and there was no key. I looked around the workshop, my eyes scanning the rows of tools. My father was a craftsman. He could make anything, but he could probably also open anything. I found a long, thin crowbar and a heavy mallet. It felt wrong, using his tools to break into his secret, but I had no choice. I wedged the tip of the crowbar under the first latch and struck the end with the mallet. The sound rang through the silent workshop like a gunshot. It took 3 hard blows before the metal bent with a sharp crack, and the latch sprang open. I did the same with the second one. Then, with a deep breath, I lifted the lid. The air that escaped smelled of old paper and dust, and something else, the dry, distinct scent of money. The box was full. On top was a thick, sealed manila envelope. My name, Ilara, was written on it in my father's blocky, unfamiliar handwriting. Beneath the envelope were stacks and stacks of cash, bundled in paper bands. $100 bills. I lifted one bundle. It was thick, heavy. There had to be tens of thousands of dollars here, maybe more. I sat back on my heels, my mind reeling. Where did this come from? A workplace accident. That's what they told me. But carpenters who die in accidents don't usually have safes full of cash hidden under their workbenches. A cold dread seeped into my bones. This wasn't just a secret. It was a dangerous one. I picked up the envelope. It was heavy, thick with paper. My name on the front seemed to stare back at me. This was for me. This whole thing, the hidden compartment, the money, this letter, was a message he had left behind, a final communication from a ghost. My hands shook so badly I could barely break the seal. I pulled out a thick sheaf of folded papers. It was a letter, handwritten on yellow legal paper. The first page began with 2 words that sent a tremor through my entire body. My Alara, it read. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the worst has happened. I am so sorry. I know you must hate me. I know you believe I abandoned you. I need you to know that isn't the truth. Not the whole truth, anyway. Leaving you was the hardest thing I have ever done, but I did it to save your life. I had to stop reading. The words were a physical blow. I stood up and walked to the workshop door, gasping for the cold night air. The moon was high now, casting a pale, skeletal light over the neglected yard. All my life, I had built my identity on a simple, bitter foundation. My father didn't want me. He had left me. He had chosen a different life, a life that did not include his daughter. It was a painful story, but it was a simple one. It made sense. This letter, these words, they shattered that foundation. He did it to save your life. It sounded like something out of a movie, something dramatic and unbelievable. It didn't feel real. But the weight of the cash in that box, the careful, deliberate way it was all hidden, that felt very real. I went back inside and sat on the cold concrete floor. The pages of the letter spread out in my lap. I forced myself to keep reading. His handwriting was surprisingly neat, the letters carefully formed. I stumbled into something I shouldn't have, he wrote. I was working a job, a big one, for a new development company building luxury cabins up by the North Lake. Northwood Developments. The name probably means nothing to you, but here, they're powerful. They own a lot of people. One night, I was working late, finishing up some custom cabinetry, and I overheard a conversation. The project foreman, a man named Marcus Thorne, was meeting with someone else. A man I recognized from the papers, a county commissioner. They weren't talking about construction. They were talking about money. Bribes, kickbacks. It turned out Northwood was building on protected wetland, and the commissioner was the one signing the illegal permits, looking the other way in exchange for a piece of the profits. My eyes scanned the page, my mind struggling to keep up. Northwood Developments, the company that wanted to buy this land. The company Mr. Davy said was my only option. It wasn't a coincidence. I knew what I had heard was dangerous, the letter continued. These were not men you crossed. My first instinct was to keep my head down, finish the job, and forget everything. But then I saw the plans. I saw how much they were destroying, the damage they were doing to the lake, to the land your mother loved. I couldn't let it go, so I started digging. I made copies of invoices, shipping manifests, anything that looked suspicious. I found out they were using substandard materials, cutting corners everywhere, and billing the investors for top-of-the-line stuff. It was a massive fraud scheme, built on top of the environmental crimes. I had enough to burn them to the ground. A wave of nausea washed over me. This quiet carpenter, this ghost from my past, had been some kind of secret investigator. It was insane. But they found out, he wrote, and the neat handwriting grew shakier here. Thorne saw me one day, looking at papers I shouldn't have been. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eye, I knew I was a dead man. They wouldn't just fire me, they would silence me, and I knew they would use you to do it. They would find out about you, threaten you, hurt you to keep me quiet. I couldn't let that happen. You were all I had left of her, Alara. You were everything. I was crying now, silent, hot tears tracking paths through the dust on my cheeks. I cried for the little girl who had waited by the window for a father who never came. I cried for the teenager who had hardened her heart with anger and resentment. And I cried for him, for the terrifying, impossible choice he had to make. So I ran, the letter went on. But first, I had to make sure you were safe. The safest place I could think of was the one place they would never look for you. The one place where you would be a number, a file, invisible. The system. It broke my heart to do it. Every single day for 10 years, it has been a fresh hell, knowing you were in there, thinking I had abandoned you. But you were alive, you were safe. I funneled money away, cash from side jobs, saving every penny I could. It's all in the box, it's for you. It's your fresh start. Take it, Alara. Disappear. Go somewhere they can never find you and build a life for yourself. That's all I have ever wanted. The letter ended there, but there was another, smaller sheet of paper clipped to the back. P.S., it said. I couldn't bring myself to destroy the evidence. It's my confession, my last testament. If you need it, it's where we used to keep the kindling dry, under the hearthstone. I let the pages fall from my hand. The whole workshop seemed to tilt, the tools on the walls blurring. My entire life, my entire story of myself, had been a lie. Not a malicious lie, but a necessary one. A story he had allowed me to believe to keep me safe. The anger I had carried for so long felt pointless now, a heavy coat I no longer needed to wear. But in its place was a profound, aching grief, and a terrifying question. What now? I stumbled out of the workshop and into the night. The air was frigid, and it felt good, a sharp shock to my system. I walked without thinking, past the sagging house, down the overgrown driveway, and onto the dirt road. I just walked, the moon my only light. The money in the box was my escape. It was exactly what he wanted for me. A new identity, a new city, a life free from the ghosts of Sparrow Creek. I could be gone by morning, no one would ever know. It was the smart choice. The safe choice. But as I walked, I thought about George at the hardware store. You've got his eyes. I thought about the half-finished birdhouse on the workbench, a small act of creation in a life defined by hiding. I thought about the developer, Northwood, the same company that had driven my father into a life of fear and loneliness, now poised to bulldoze his memory and pave over the land my mother had loved. Running felt like a betrayal. It felt like letting them win. After everything he had sacrificed, was I really going to let them get away with it? Was I going to take the blood money and run, just like they had forced him to do? If you've ever reached a crossroads in your life, a moment where you had to choose between the easy path and the right one, you know the feeling that was churning in my gut. It's a cold, heavy certainty. I find that a lot of people in this community have faced moments like that. It's why we're here, to share these stories, because sometimes, just knowing you're not the only one to face an impossible choice makes all the difference. I turned around and walked back. My steps were heavier now, but more certain. I went back into the house, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The living room fireplace was a gaping black hole, filled with old leaves and debris. The hearth was made of large, flat field stones. I ran my hands over them, pushing and pulling. One of them, on the far left, was loose. I wedged my fingers underneath and lifted. It came away easily. Beneath it was a small, hollowed-out space. Inside was another metal box, this one much smaller, like a cash box. It was unlocked. I opened it. There was no money inside. Instead, there was a thin ledger book and a small, cheap microcassette recorder. I picked up the ledger. The pages were filled with my father's neat script, dates, names, dollar amounts, shipment numbers. It was the evidence he had mentioned, a meticulous record of the fraud. Then I looked at the recorder. I pressed the play button. A low hiss filled the silent room, and then I heard his voice. It was hesitant, rough, full of a pain that transcended the tinny speaker. "My name is Frank Vance," he said. "I'm making this recording because I don't know what else to do. If anyone finds this, it means I'm dead, and it means Marcus Thorne and Northwood Developments killed me." He went on to detail everything he had told me in the letter, but this time with names, specific dates, and details of the conversations he'd overheard. It was a confession, an accusation, and a last-ditch effort for justice. He ended the tape with a message for me. "Ilara," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you. I never stopped. Be safe. Live a good life. That's all that matters." The tape clicked off, but his voice hung in the air. That was it, the whole story. The money was my escape. The ledger and the tape were my weapons. He had given me a choice. He had left it up to me to decide what his legacy would be. A daughter who ran and saved herself, or a daughter who stayed and fought for him. Standing there in the cold, dark house, surrounded by the ghosts of my family, the choice felt terrifyingly clear. I couldn't run. I wouldn't. The next morning, I called Mr. Davies. "I'm not selling," I said, my voice steady. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Ilara," he finally said, his tone cautious. "We need to talk about this. The taxes." "I can pay them," I said. "I'm coming into your office this afternoon with the money." Another pause. "All right," he said, sounding bewildered. "I'll draw up the paperwork." I took $10,000 from the box, wrapped it in a grocery bag, and put it in my backpack. It felt like a ridiculously large sum of money, and walking into town with it felt dangerous. But when I placed it on Mr. Davies' desk, the look on his face was a mixture of shock and dawning understanding. He didn't ask where the money came from. He just looked at me, his gaze lingering, and I think he saw something in my face, some new resolve that hadn't been there 2 days before. "This will clear your debt with the county," he said, counting the bills slowly. "The property is yours, free and clear. But Ilara, Northwood won't be happy. They don't like to be told no." "I'm not scared of them," I said, and for the first time in my life, it felt true. With the property secured, the real work began. I started with the house. I tore down the rotten curtains, letting sunlight stream into the dusty rooms for the first time in years. I scrubbed the floors, washed the windows, and dragged the sheet-draped furniture outside to air out. It was back-breaking work. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest. But with every bucket of dirty water I poured out, with every layer of grime I wiped away, I felt like I was cleaning out a part of myself, scrubbing away the bitterness and neglect that had defined my life. I made a list and walked to the hardware store. George, the owner, greeted me with a warm smile. "Back again," he said. "Thought you might be." I showed him my list. I need everything. Cleaning supplies, paint, spackle, new locks." He looked at the long list and whistled. "Got a big project on your hands." "I've got time," I said. He helped me gather everything, offering advice on the best paint for damp wood and the easiest way to fix a sticky window. As he was ringing me up, he paused. "You know," he said, leaning on the counter, "if you need a hand with any of the heavy lifting, my boy and I could come by on Saturday. Your dad helped me rebuild my roof after the big storm a few years back. Be nice to pay it forward." I was so surprised, I didn't know what to say. Thank you," I managed. "I'd really appreciate that." It was a small offer, but it felt huge. It was the first thread of connection to this town, to this community. I wasn't just Frank Vance's ghost daughter anymore. I was a neighbor. A week later, the first letter from Northwood's lawyers arrived. The tone was no longer friendly. It spoke of eminent domain, of zoning regulations I was supposedly violating, and it made a new, even higher offer. It was an intimidation tactic, plain and simple. I threw it in the trash. The days fell into a rhythm: work, eat, sleep. I started in the house, but I always ended my days in the workshop. It was my favorite place. I started to clean and organize it, but not to pack it away. I was learning it. I ran my hands over the tools, learning their names and their functions. I found old woodworking magazines and read them at night by flashlight. I even took the half-finished birdhouse from the workbench and started sanding it, trying to feel my way through the motions, to understand the craft that had been his life. One evening, sitting on the porch I had just finished repairing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, I finally understood what inheritance meant. It wasn't the money in the box or the deed to the land. It was the choice he had given me. He had spent the last decade of his life trapped by his secret, living in the shadows. But he had saved and scraped and planned so that I wouldn't have to. He had given me enough money to run, but he had also left me the tools to stay. The ledger, the tape, and the workshop full of saws and hammers and chisels. He was giving me the means to fight back and the means to rebuild. The house was still a wreck, but it was a work in progress. My work in progress. Every patched wall, every clean window was a victory. I was slowly, painstakingly, turning this ruin into a home. My home. I had taken the ledger and the tape and put them back in the cash box, which I then took to a bank in the next town over and put in a safe deposit box. They were my insurance policy. I didn't know how or when I would use them, but I knew I couldn't let Northwood win. I couldn't let them bulldoze this place and build their sterile, soulless resort on the land my parents had loved. This was more than just a fight over property. It was a fight for my father's memory. It was about proving that his sacrifice meant something. It was about finishing the job he had started. The loneliness I had carried with me my whole life was beginning to fade. It was being replaced by something else, something solid and quiet. Purpose. I wasn't just a girl who had aged out of the system anymore. I was the daughter of Frank Vance, the carpenter, and I had work to do. As the seasons began to turn and the first hints of spring started to thaw the frozen ground, I felt a change not just in the land, but in myself. The fear that had been a constant companion for so long was still there, a low hum in the background, but it no longer controlled me. The legal threats from Northwood continued, each letter more aggressive than the last, but they felt like noise from a distant storm. My focus was here, on the tangible world in front of me, on replacing a rotted floorboard, on reglazing a window, on coaxing a long dormant garden back to life. George and his son, a quiet boy named Sam, came over on weekends. They helped me fix the sag in the roof and showed me how to use a circular saw without losing a finger. They never asked about my past or where the money for the supplies was coming from. They just showed up with coffee and donuts and a willingness to work. Through them, I met others. A retired plumber who helped me get the water running again in exchange for a few birdhouses I'd learned to make. A woman from the local preservation society who heard about my fight with Northwood and brought over boxes of historical documents about the area, arming me with information about land rights and protected zones. Slowly, a community was building around me, a quiet network of support. They were people like my father, decent, hardworking, with a deep-rooted love for this place and a distrust of outsiders who saw it only as a resource to be exploited. One day, Mr. Davies called me. "They're trying to have the property rezoned," he said, his voice grave. "They're petitioning the county council. Thorne is leading the charge. They're claiming your property is an abandoned blight and a danger to the community." "It's not abandoned," I said, looking out the window at the new porch railing I had just finished painting. "I know that, Alara," he said, "but you're going to have to prove it. The council meeting is in a month. You need to be there." The moment I had been waiting for, the one I had been dreading, had arrived. It was time to stop fixing the house and start fighting the war. I took the bus to the next town and retrieved the cash box from the bank. That night, I sat in the workshop and listened to my father's voice on the tape recorder over and over again. I memorized the names, the dates, the details. I was terrified. These were powerful people. My father had died because of this secret. What chance did I have? But then I looked around the workshop, at the tools hanging on the walls, at the stacks of wood, at the home I was building with my own 2 hands. I had something my father didn't have. I had a community. I had a legal claim to this land, and I had nothing left to lose. The day of the council meeting, the small town hall was packed. On one side were the slick-suited lawyers from Northwood, with Marcus Thorne sitting in the front row, looking smug and confident. On the other side was me, and behind me, filling every seat, were George, Sam, the plumber, the woman from the Preservation Society, and 24 other faces from Sparrow Creek. When my turn came to speak, my hands were shaking. I walked to the podium, clutching a single piece of paper, though I didn't need it. I looked directly at Thorne. My name is Alara Vance, I began, my voice clearer and stronger than I expected. This is my home. My father, Frank Vance, built it. He loved this land. Northwood Developments says his property is a blight, but the only blight I see in this community is corporate greed. I went on, talking about the work I had done, the history of the property, the importance of preserving the wetlands they wanted to destroy. I didn't mention the ledger or the tape. Not yet. That was my ace in the hole. I was just planting a seed, letting them know that I was not the scared little girl they could easily push aside. Thorne spoke after me, his voice smooth and condescending. He talked about progress, jobs, and the economic benefits of his resort. He painted me as a sentimental child, clinging to a worthless ruin out of ignorance. But as he spoke, I watched the faces of the council members, and I watched the faces of the people behind me. They weren't buying it. When the meeting was over, the council deferred the decision. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. As I was leaving, Thorne cornered me in the hallway. "You're making a big mistake, little girl," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "You should have taken the money." "It was never about the money," I said, looking him straight in the eye. I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his face, a brief crack in his confident facade. He didn't know what I knew, and that gave me power. The fight isn't over. I know it's just the beginning. But something fundamental has shifted. I came to Sparrow Creek to deal with a dead father's property, but I found a living father's legacy instead. He left me a home, not just of wood and nails, but of purpose and principle. He left me a choice, and in making it, I found myself. Maybe you've had a story like that. Maybe you inherited something that looked like a burden but turned out to be a gift. A story you had to unlearn, a truth you had to uncover, a home you had to fight for. These are the stories that shape us. If this story resonated with you, if you understand what it's like to fight for your own little patch of ground, then I hope you'll join our community. Subscribe, leave a comment, and share a piece of your own story. Because we're all just trying to find our way home, and it's a little easier when we walk that road together.
Arrêtez! Ça marche pas, arrêtez de le mettre. Allez-y là, s'il vous plaît, s'il vous plaît, s'il vous plaît. Est-ce que quelqu'un a un point de chaîne? Ah, j'en peux plus, je vous jure, il va me faire péter un plomb ce truc-là. Qu'est-ce que j'ai fait?
Ciao, ciao.
Attendez, faut que je baisse ma musique, moi j'entends rien. Plo Koon, en fait, on parlait de toi, avec Groot, parce que j'ai appris que c'est toi qui allais le remplacer pendant les vacances. Et du coup, je lui ai dit: «Ah vas-y, viens, on va à la boutique et tout pour que je puisse rencontrer, Plo Koon, qu'on puisse se voir enfin». Avant que
Ciao,
j'arrive, mais ça a pas marché.
ciao.
Oui, oui, bah oui, ça marche pas, papy, sur l'écran, sur l'écran. Bon, on est bon là.